Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're really pleased to have you here for today's event, Nazism, Neo-Nazism, and Music, which we have Spencer Sunshine with us. Spencer Sunshine has spent the last 15 years studying contemporary fascist movements. He's currently finishing a book on the origins of James Mason's neo-Nazi terrorist manual, Siege, as well as working on an anthology of his own writings about anti-Semitism on the left and right. This program is really Spencer's brainchild, and we've been very lucky to work with Spencer on a number of programs, including our Yiddish Anarchism Conference, New Scholarship on a Forgotten Tradition, an event on Bundism's Influence Today, an event on Why the Far Right Kills, an event on leftists discussing left-wing anti-Semitism, and he's taught for us, so we're really pleased to have Spencer with us today. Before I hand it over to Spencer for today's event, I'll just say a brief word about YIVO. YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library of over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers from around the world use. And in addition to making that material available, we have a variety of public programs like this one, classes, exhibitions, all meant to bring to life this world. So without further ado, Spencer, thank you so much. I'll hand it over.
All right, thank you, Alex. This is welcome to what's going to be my last panel that I've organized for a while at YIVO. I'm trying to take some time off and finish the couple books that Alex mentioned. I do want to say since 2018, I have put together a number of books, a number of events at YIVO, and Alex named them. And I want to say they're all available, as are all other recent YIVO talks on YouTube's YIVO's channel, and I encourage people to check them out there. So there's a whole generation that thinks about National Socialism and music at the same time. And this is people who are involved in the punk and skinhead scene in the 1980s and 90s, and for whom the Nazi skinhead movement left an indelible impression. The question of National Socialism in music is usually thought of in relationship to the post-war countercultures, but in fact, it is much broader. I first realized this when talking to a guide at a former concentration camp, and I referred to the Nazi imagery of an industrial band. This included using the chimney at Auschwitz in a stylized logo and naming their songs things like Zyklon B. But my friend objected, and she said the Nazis both hid the camps out of view, and the music that they used was quite conservative, unlike these more avant-garde bands. So that got me to thinking about Nazism and music in a much broader sense. I want to say this panel is specifically about National Socialism and not white supremacy. People often collapse the two, and sometimes even veer into anti-Semitism erasure when they do so. National Socialism is an explicit political philosophy that can exist independently of white supremacists. It can talk different, act different, be opposed to other factions in the white supremacist movement, and even has been embraced by non-white groups, especially outside of the global north. It's also hard to believe that a non-Nazi white supremacist movement would have had much appeal to skinheads. For example, I've talked to more than one former Nazi skinhead who've said that they despise the Klan, for example. That said, it is true that this line can become fuzzy, and it's become not uncommon for some white supremacists to use National Socialist imagery and even some of the ideas, but mostly layered upon a traditional white supremacist ideology. The Anti-Defamation League even downgraded the swastika's meaning to be a general hate symbol that may be directed not just at Jews, but towards all different kinds of historically oppressed groups. Kirsten Dyck will cover some of this in more detail, but I do want to point out some of my favorite examples about the conjunction of National Socialism and music in the post-war era, which is the era that I study. So in the 1960s, there were country music Ku Klux Klan records, but also the American Nazi Party, which did distinguish itself from the Klan of its day, ran a record label called Hate Nanny Records, and they put out a couple of 7-inch singles. Their name itself was a parody of Hoot Nanny, the name that was given for performances by the strongly left-leaning folk groups of the day. And Hate Nanny presaged later white supremacist record labels like Resistance Records, which exclusively released politically aligned bands. Second, music didn't just come out of neo-Nazi structures and parties. These parties also reached out to musicians and counterculturalists. For example, I found out recently in Graham Macklin's book about fascism in Britain that the notorious fascist organizer Oswald Mosley actually recorded the Teddy Boys, who were rockabilly fans in the first post-war British counterculture. Also, the National Front in the 1970s and 80s aggressively recruited the skinhead movement to great success, and this definitely influenced the Nazi skinhead movement in America. One of the first groups was called the American Front, taking off the National Front. And as the National Front splintered, the different factions vied to keep the skinhead contingent on their side and their new parties and groups. Also, at first, neo-Nazis claimed that the musical pedigree of Oi, which is a kind of stripped-down punk rock that skinheads listened to in the 70s and 80s, that Oi was exclusively derived from white sources, which is a ludicrous claim. But more recently, as Dick will cover, Nazi music has become unmoored from genres entirely, and even traditionally Black music is up for grabs. And so my favorite example, and I'm going to spare you playing a sample of this, it is a Swedish dub reggae band called Panzerfaust Gestapo SS. And they have songs, they put an EP out in 2010, and they have songs like Third Reich Rhythm and Go Back to Africa. And the funny thing about this is that they're not a bad dub act. And one thing that you'll find out listening to this music is just because a musician is a Nazi doesn't mean that they don't lack talent. There are so many angles to this issue that I personally could talk about it for hours. Our four panelists will look at different time periods and approaches to this issue, from the Holocaust to the alt-right, and from a position of scholarly detachment to very personal experience. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they'll appear. Edward Westermann is a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, and his most recent book is Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany. Kirsten Dyck is the author of Reichsrock, the International Web of White Power and Neo-Nazi Hate Music. And she's being a real mensch because she's joining us from China, and it's about 2 a.m. there. So I want to give a special shout out to her. Since leaving the white supremacist movement over 25 years ago, former Nazi skinhead Shannon Foley Martinez has worked for school systems, nonprofits, and community organizations to build preventative models of counter-extremism, and also to help people who want to leave the movement. She helps mentor them go through that process. Last, Luca Signorelli was the co-editor of the magazine Metal Hammer Italy, and he's the author of 2 best-selling volumes on heavy metal and extreme rock, the Encyclopedia Metalis, as well as the Metalhead Aesthetic. And last, I want to give thanks to Courtney Brock at Rutgers University Press, as well as Alex and Jane at YIVO. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Edward.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thanks to Jane and Alex as well for setting up this event. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully our technical support here will work. And hopefully everyone can see that. Thumbs up. Okay. This is probably what most people think about when they think about music and National Socialism, is the idea of the prisoner orchestras in the camps. What I'd like to do today is I want to move beyond that kind of understanding to talk about the ways in which music and song, other ways that they were actually integrated into National Socialism and even into the process of mass murder. So under National Socialism, music and song played a key role in promoting the creation of, quote, imagined communities within the Nazi paramilitary arms and became an ideologized propaganda tool, especially within the party's paramilitary and youth organizations. In fact, song and music under fascism was critical for, quote, expressing an ideology suffused with anger, hatred, and violence. Songs with aggressive lyrics serve to prime aggressive thoughts, perceptions, and behavior, particularly when combined with alcohol consumption. The historian George Mosse identified the methods by which poetry and song became instruments of German nationalists during the interwar period to promote concepts of camaraderie, sacrifice, and, quote, the ideal of manliness as symbolic of personal and national regeneration. In this case, not only the lyrics, but also the volume and intensity of the song signified camaraderie, aggression, and belligerent masculinity. Furthermore, music and song in the Third Reich also reinforced the regime's martial goals and gender roles by promoting soldierly values among young men and domesticity and childbearing among young women. Song was also a means for expressing ideological belief and personal commitment. For the paramilitary formations of the Nazi Party, heavy drinking combined with song served as, quote, an inspiration for political battle and as an important ritual emphasizing male camaraderie and advertising the group's readiness to use terror against one's enemies. In Cologne on March 13th, 1927, the day of local Jewish community elections, a group of 40 Nazi Party members marched past the synagogue in the Runstrasse, bellowing provocative anti-Semitic songs. Individual marchers then began to, quote, bump into Jews leaving the synagogue, leading to a brawl in which 3 Jews received knife wounds. In another example, an SA unit marched through a Berlin suburb singing the refrain, quote, "We are the Nazi guys from the murderer unit of Charlottenburg." These acts of political violence were an expression of male politics in which toughness, readiness to stand one's ground, and never quit the field were values associated with manliness. As they marched into battle on the streets or within the beer hall, SA men used, quote, songs of triumph and hate to threaten their enemies with broken bones and to assert their masculinity through the ability to physically dominate their opponents. For German Jews, these public spectacles were threatening, if not terrifying. A 12-year-old Joseph Stone remembered, quote, Nazi big parades in the evening, their flags, their music, and torchlight parades at night. Nobody went outside. No one felt secure. No one. For her part, Bella Fromm remembered the, quote, dreaded stamping of boots by a group of SA men and their chants of, quote, to hell with the Jews, shameful death to the Jews, during the April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses. When one considers these slogans and the lyrics to popular SA and SS songs, with phrases such as, quote, stand the Jews, stand the bosses on the wall, and when Jewish blood spurts from the knife, it is hardly surprising that German Jews felt endangered when engulfed by such public and thunderous expressions of hatred and violence. The integration of music, dance, and song into acts of humiliation and physical abuse was a common occurrence that reflected the perpetrator's sense of domination and revealed their enjoyment in the suffering of their victims. In Dachau, Hugo Burkhardt recalled the SS guards singing the refrain, quote, when the Jew's blood spurts from the knife, then it is a wonderful time, as the customary prelude to pending acts of abuse against the camp's Jewish inmates. Not only did song and music serve as instruments of domination, but, quote, concentration camp guards often abused music, using it as an instrument of torture, as a means of violence and sadism, and as a symbol of their absolute power. Hans Beimler, an imprisoned German communist, recalled the so-called dance of death, involving the guards' celebratory ritual in the wake of a horrific beating of a fellow prisoner. Beimler offered a detailed description of the events. Quote, there were 2 SA nurses, and their duty was to, quote, care for Comrade Fritz Dressel. I jumped. The beasts were beginning to play music in their room. From the tone, I could distinguish a zither, a guitar, and an accordion. There was insane yelling, wild whooping. Gay, drunken songs were sung, accompanied by music. I was no longer surprised that they had drunk heavily at the same time. That was part of their joviality. My thought was only, what will Fritz do? How it must hurt him in that condition. He is being tortured with musical instruments instead of with blows. The guards' incorporation of alcohol, music, and song during prisoner punishments offers an insight into the way in which violence was normalized, legitimized, and even celebrated within the camps. The abuse of prominent prisoners who were, quote, greeted with songs of ridicule and mocking welcoming ceremonies also exposes the importance of music in these acts. At the Sobibor killing site, SS guards incorporated music into an elaborate ritual of entertainment and humiliation in which a Jewish inmate was forced to lie down in a wooden chest, wearing a silk kaftan and a shtreimel, as a guard closed the lid to this makeshift coffin and broke into song. Quote, I am a Jew with a long snout. Beloved God, hearken to our song. Stop up the Jews' voices so that mankind will have relief. Amen. As he sang, the SS guards forced a group of Jewish inmates to sway back and forth as if praying while shouting, Amen. Within the concentration camps, fellowship evenings featuring alcohol, song, and performative acts of male dominance constituted a customary celebratory ritual for the perpetrators. The camp canteen at the Belchet's Killing Center also was a site of bacchanalian excess involving alcohol, music, and sexual coercion. Rudolf Reda, a prisoner, recalled that every Sunday evening, the SS ordered the camp orchestra to play for the entertainment of the guards, as the guards, quote, gorged themselves and threw scraps of leftovers to the musicians. In this case, Sunday, a traditional day of rest and religious ceremony, experienced a transformation into a ritualistic SS celebration of the previous week's killings and a preparation for the next. The inclusion of the prisoner musicians and the public nature of such rituals within or near the camp offer a clear example of the way in which the perpetrators remade these spaces into festive sites. In her analysis of the use of music at the killing sites in occupied Poland, Katarzyna Mazurek observed, quote, the use of music had two main interlinked goals: to provide entertainment for the perpetrators, also by ridiculing the victims, and to function as a psychological torture for the prisoners. In this sense, the throwing of scraps of food to the musicians, as one might do with a pet, exemplified the dehumanization and ridicule experienced by the prisoner musicians at the hands of their SS masters. Within the SS and police, singing and music also followed mass killings. In post-war testimony, a former prisoner at Sachsenhausen described massacres there in the fall of 1941 as, quote, SS murder orgies that grew into real parties, while schnapps poured in rivers and loudspeakers played music over the screams of the victims. In another gruesome example, a Jewish woman recalled the aftermath of a killing operation at Przemysl. Quote, I smelled the odor of burning bodies and saw a group of Gestapo men who sat by the fire, singing and drinking. For these Gestapo men, victory celebrations proved to be the order of the day, and these festive rituals followed every, quote, liberation from the Jews, i.e. killing action. In a similar example, SS men ordered Leon Wells, a Jewish prisoner, to bury the victims of a just completed massacre. Upon his arrival, Wells saw, quote, a group of SS men who were there, entertaining themselves with schnapps and music. Round them lay a countless number of corpses. In another example, SS Colonel Walter Blume, the commander of Sonderkommando 7A, took his men on recreational outings after mass killings, where, according to Blume, quote, in the evenings I had songs sung at the campfire. In these cases, song became an expression of community, camaraderie, and shared values in the wake of mass murder. A unit of SS cavalrymen returned from a mass killing in the city of Mosgier and, quote, marched back into town, singing like a group of recruits back from a field exercise. The use of song, like the closed military formation used by these perpetrators, was not only an expression of shared camaraderie and male bonding, but also a demonstration of political belief and an affirmation of murder. Likewise, men who sang in communal spaces, arrayed in ranks, laid physical and verbal claim to these sites, a public assertion of their acts, combining military and celebratory ritual in one. At a killing site in Ukraine, inebriated German policemen murdered groups of civilians and Soviet prisoners of war to the accompaniment of accordion music played by a unit member. At the Janovska forced labor camp near Lvov, the SS staff created a special orchestra to accompany tortures, atrocities, and shootings. At Majdanek on 3 November 1943, specially selected SS and police personnel murdered 18,000 Jewish men, women, and children as part of Operation Harvest Festival. The victims were forced to undress and driven into prepared ditches, where they were shot as, quote, Vienna waltzes, tangos, and marches blared over the camp's loudspeakers. In numerous examples, the perpetrators also incorporated music and song and drinking rituals into acts of sexual violence. In August 1941, Genia Demianova, a Russian school teacher, was interrogated by a German soldier who tortured, whipped, and brutally raped her. She remembered, quote, there is a roar of cheering, the clinking of many glasses. The sergeant is standing in the open doorway. The wildcat is tamed, he is saying. Boys, she was a virgin. What do you say to that? Another burst of cheering. The others came in. 10, 100, 1,000, one after another. They flung themselves upon me, digging into my wounds while they defiled me. After the attacks ended, she lay naked and battered on the floor and heard, quote, the sound of a sentimental Schumann song. The sounds came from the next room where my executioners were singing. Sexual assaults also occurred in Auschwitz-Birkenau, as noted by Ruth Elias, who recalled drunken SS men bursting into her barrack at night that also housed the camp orchestra. Elias remembered, quote, first of all, the SS men woke up the orchestra and the music had to play. And then they started to climb up and look for nice women and take them out. And the girls had to sleep with them. The girls were screaming, and that was terrible, terrible. For these intoxicated SS men, the incorporation of music apparently provided an important festive accompaniment to their communal acts of rape. In conclusion, the fusion of alcohol, music, and song with mass murder shows how violence was normalized, even celebrated by the Nazis. Under the Nazi regime, music and song forged community, camaraderie, and shared purpose. In unit bars, around campfires, and at the killing sites, the addition of music was more than just a form of entertainment. It was also an instrument for promoting a common purpose and bringing people together. Ultimately, genocide is a societal endeavor. Music and song, like political philosophies, are part of a society's cultural artifacts. When mass murder becomes a central tenet of a society, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that these atrocities were carried out against the backdrop of a stirring song, a rousing military march, or a sentimental Schumann lied. After all, the music had to play. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Your terrifying scholarship. I think it is important that people do document and we remember these things. So for a more contemporary take, Kirsten Dyck is up next.
Okay, so just getting my slides there. So are my slides visible here? I'm getting a nod. Okay, so my job today is to talk about neo-Nazi music, as Spencer mentioned, but it is really impossible to talk about the history of neo-Nazi music without talking about some what Spencer would call like white supremacist music or white power non-Nazi music, as well as talking about some music that actually is considered more mainstream or non-racist or ambiguously racist, because all of these things play off of each other in the post-war era. And I'm not going to hit every single subgenre, but I'm going to try to give sort of an overview of what happened, mostly focusing on about 1980 to the present with the exception of the first subgenre here, which is the hate country music that Spencer mentioned from the 1960s. Like Hate and Nanny Records was one, and Rebel Records was another one that put out a lot of singles mostly. The most famous hate country performer by far, at least today, whose music continues to be sold alongside the later neo-Nazi rock bands, is Johnny Rebel. His real name was Clifford Trahan, and you can see him here in, I believe, his high school yearbook photo from the 1950s, and then just before his death just recently. And he actually released a few anti-Muslim songs in 2006 after a 50-year hiatus. But these records didn't get a huge following right away. I mean, they sold kind of at Ku Klux Klan booths at county fairs and things like that in the South. So they would have sold a couple hundred or maybe a couple thousand copies max at that point, and maybe have played on some local radio stations, but not have gotten a very wide distribution. Except that some of the records made their way into the hands of some of the skinhead bands from the 1980s, who looked at them and took them as inspiration. And this is partially because some of these musicians, and Johnny Rebel was one of them, were actually quite adept musicians. Clifford Trahan was a Nashville session guitar player who played backup guitar on quite a few other albums that were, not racist. But the vast majority of the music that's on the market that's still for sale today as neo-Nazi or as white power music did kind of get its start in the early 1980s. We've been talking a little bit about the skinhead scene, and it is really important when we talk about skinheads to emphasize, first of all, that there are a lot of different kinds of skinheads with a lot of different political affiliations. The vast majority of people who have been skinheads have never been racist, and some of them are vehemently anti-racist and have gotten into a lot of fist fights with Nazi skinheads. And the earliest skinheads in the 60s, here you can see some of the early British skinheads. And in the picture on the left here, you can even see that this particular skinhead crew in the 60s has a non-white member, as was fairly common. A lot of the music that they were listening to and playing at that point was reggae based and had really obvious markers of Afro-Caribbean or African-American identity in it. In the 80s, the skinhead identity kind of got a rebrand, and the fashion became much more militaristic. In the 60s, it was just kind of working class, an emphasis on that working class appearance with the suspenders and the work boots and things like that. In the 80s, it moved from just regular Doc Martens to the really tall, steel toe boots and the military paraphernalia. And this is when the haircuts went from short to bald, and tattoos became really prevalent. And this is also when the neo-Nazi ideologies kind of start entering the skinhead movement, and when the music picks up. So the main person who is primarily identified with starting or kicking off the neo-Nazi music genre is Ian Stewart Donaldson, who was the lead singer of a band called Screwdriver with an SK, that actually was playing on some of the same stages as what we would consider to be non-racist or non-political punk bands at the time, like Susie and the Banshees, who sometimes appeared in public wearing swastikas as provocation. And a lot of the other punk bands that were on the scene at the time, the Sex Pistols, for example, like had a song called Belson Was a Gas. The Ramones from the US, who actually had several Jewish members, you know, had Blitzkrieg Bop, right? So the punk movement in the 1970s was emphasizing provocation at all costs, trying to get a rise out of people. And what's the best way to get a rise out of people, especially in England, but also in the US in the 1970s, you know, when a lot of people's dads were World War II veterans and a lot of people's, you know, parents and grandparents had lived through the Blitz and stuff. Well, you walk down a London high street wearing a swastika on your t-shirt, like Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. Well, Ian Stewart Donaldson and some of his colleagues saw this and were kind of taken by it and thought, you know, they actually had right-wing political beliefs, and thought, you know, we could actually do this. And in the very early years of the 80s, you get Ian Stewart Donaldson on stage at a big concert full of lots of different kinds of skinheads, racist, non-racist, anti-racist, giving a Hitler salute to the crowd. And that was really what kind of kicked it off. And he kind of got pushed to the fringes of the skinhead movement in terms of the skinheads who were anti-racist or non-political, who didn't kind of want to have anything to do with people who were actually Nazis. And that led to a decision point. Like, did he want to be part of the mainstream punk scene, or was he gonna really do this? And he and his band and a few other bands really did this, and they started affiliating themselves with the National Front, with the British movement, and increasingly also with extreme right-wing groups from abroad. So I do have a few musical examples. I'm not going to play anything really long, just to kind of give you an idea of what this sounds like, but I don't have tons of time. So this is, I'm going to play just a little tiny clip of a song called They Stand Alone, by the British band No Remorse, which was fronted by Paul Burnley. His real name is Paul Bellany. His father is actually quite a famous Scottish painter, John Bellany, hence the need to use a pseudonym. But the song They Stand Alone is referring to Israel standing alone, with a lot of quite anti-Semitic references in the lyrics. I'm just going to play like 30 seconds of it here. Okay, that's enough of that, just to give you an idea of kind of what it sounded like. So this is a subgenre of punk called oi punk that they're playing at this point. It quite stripped down, quite a sparse sound, similar to a lot of the punk bands that were playing in Britain and in the US at this point. And they started to spread through American and British troops who were stationed in West Germany. through the end of the 1980s, as a result of those post-World War treaties, there were some right-wing members of the armed forces that were stationed there. And so some of these records started to spread and started to get into the Western European scene. So in the early to mid 1980s already, we're starting to get some similar sounding music coming out in Germany. The Böse Onkels actually are a really popular band that put out a few racist songs in the early 80s and have since apologized for it and have had a storied career. But some of the other bands that were playing on the same scene were really Nazis, and through the course of the 1980s became increasingly more and more and more neo-Nazi, and it helped introduce Ian Stewart Donaldson and the British scene to like actual Nazis, like some of the actual guys who had actually performed the murders 40 years earlier. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side here, the label, the little circular label says Rockorama Records. That was the major white power music label in the 1980s, basically, and that was out of West Germany. The guy who owned it was not especially political, but he was raking in cash and was willing to put out a lot of very overtly political neo-Nazi records until basically he got shut down, and he also got outcompeted later on. So this kind of music is spreading, and at this point in the early to mid 80s, late 80s, it's also spreading elsewhere, not only Germany. Spread to the US. So here we have a band called RAHOWA, short for Racial Holy War, fronted by George Birdie, who's out of Toronto, Canada. And he and some of his colleagues founded Resistance Records. They went across into Detroit to found it because the US has more lenient hate speech laws. Resistance Records ended up being the preeminent white power music label in the US. And you can kind of see here, like this is their music magazine. It's one of the covers of their music magazines. And this was kind of the look of a lot of the bands, but George Birdie actually renounced racism later on. So his label continued to put out racist music for years and years, for probably 10 years at least. After he left, it was sold to William Pierce from the National Alliance, who then died and left it to some of his successors who kind of ran it into the ground. But it was still selling a lot of albums in the early 2000s into like 2010, 2012, when I was starting to do my research on this. The music also spread into Eastern Europe. So this here is a band called Sokira Peruna, a Ukrainian band. The Sokira Peruna, the Hammer of Perun. So Perun is a Slavic god, and they're mixing Slavic pagan mythology into their lyrics and stuff like that. So Kira Peruna is still around, making lots of political music about the conflict with Russia, in addition to Nazi ideologies and stuff. So when it got to Eastern Europe, all of the conflict in Eastern Europe got pulled into the Nazi ideology. But interestingly enough, this is one of the things that started to make the neo-Nazis come around to Eastern Europeans as being actually white, realizing their governments aren't suppressing them the way a lot of Western European governments were suppressing bands. You know, a lot of big festivals are now held in Russia and Ukraine because they don't get shut down. And the Germans and the Brits are kind of seeing this as an opportunity. And there were a lot of bands also in South America and Australia, and I don't have enough time to get into the details on that, but it's pretty much everywhere, right? In the late 1980s, we started getting heavier punk music. This is when the screamy stuff that's very difficult to understand starts to enter the market. Hatecore music, hardcore punk with hateful lyrics, like, for example, this album here by the Angry Aryans, who put out several album covers that are all similarly graphic. And other bands like the Blue Eyed Devils. At this point, Blue Eyed Devils are still around, still playing gigs, as far as I can see. I know they certainly were in 2018. So there's still a market for this stuff even now, like 30 years later. And you started getting Viking influences coming in from Scandinavia and also from Germany. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. Some of these bands are super racist, like the woman on the right here, the singer Saga, gives Nazi salutes when she sings in public. But the guys in the photo at the center, the band Ultima Thule, have sort of been associated with Nazi groups, have said publicly that they're not involved, but then, you know, evidence keeps popping up that maybe they are involved with Nazis, and it's really hard to figure out where the boundary is, where things are actually delimited between really racist music and music that is non-political, or, you know, just talking about Vikings because we love the history of the Vikings, versus talking about Vikings as a metaphor for Nazi Germany, but we can't talk about Nazi Germany, so we'll pretend that it's medieval Scandinavia that's being invaded instead. And there's a lot of music with Viking imagery in it, in the white power canon. And that sort of all starts up in about the late 80s as well. In the late 80s and early 90s, and I think Luca is going to talk more about the metal scene in later on the panel, you start getting National Socialist Black Metal, or NSBM. It's mostly associated in the popular consciousness with the Scandinavian bands, especially the Norwegians, who murdered a bunch of people and burned down a 12th century stave church to protest Christianity, which they thought was associated with Judaism and had no place in Norway. But the band in the picture on the right here, Graveland, is a Polish band, and there's been a lot of NSBM that's come out of Eastern Europe and out of the US and out of other countries as well. A lot of this, like the hatecore music, is very difficult to understand. Like the lyrics are almost unintelligible in some cases, although not in all. So this was, you know, the late 80s and the 90s, the era of, you know, even mainstream bands just kind of screaming into the microphone. A lot of us probably remember that industrial rock era when mosh pits were huge, and all of that was feeding into the white power scene. You also had stuff that was much more stripped down, much more acoustic. Some of it was a little bit of a gimmick, like Prussian Blue, these two twin girls whose mother started putting them out on the neo-Nazi music circuit when they were about 5 years old. They're all grown up now and have renounced Nazism, but you can see here, like they were on the scene for a good 10 years performing with their guitar and violin and writing songs and stuff. Much more serious artists also do this. So you can see Frank Rennecke from Germany here, the one with the Hitler mustache and the Hitler haircut. And he's actually run for national office as a candidate on the NPD, or Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschland's ticket, which is sort of one of the big neo-Nazi parties in Germany. He's also been arrested for spreading hate speech and stuff like that. He's written a song like a happy birthday song to Hitler, and things like that, but all of it with his acoustic guitar. And so this music is not only heavy rock music. There's lots of different types of music available, and in a lot of different languages. Punkrenika mostly performs in German, right? You also had a very small market, I would say, in the 90s for what was called white noise music, or sort of experimental music. On the left, we have Boyd Rice, who maybe wasn't super political, but flirted with Nazism. It's hard to know what he actually believed some of the time. And then the band Blood Axis, which was really just Michael Moynihan, a Nazi activist who really was very political and sometimes would mix like fiddle music in with industrial rock and electronic stuff. I wouldn't normally throw it in, except that this fed into some of the music that's going on now that's become more popular. I would say like in the last 5 years or so, this what's called fash wave. So this is, I'm getting into like the stuff that people are making right now, because most of the kids are not listening to the heavy rock music anymore. The kids are listening to kind of synth pop music. And I'll throw on just a really short clip from this band, Jurius here, if I can get it. To give you just an idea of how different this actually sounds. So it's time to grow up as we're ticking down the clock. Forever keep in mind we're fighting for our kind, to learn from those before, our future made secure. So if you didn't catch that, they're referencing in this very cleaned up way the 14 words from David Lane. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, which is one of the neo-Nazi, the standards of the neo-Nazi platform. And the other thing that's going on, I know I've talked for a really long time. So the other thing that's going on right now is Nazi hip hop, believe it or not. Yeah, so a lot of the kids are listening to hip hop. So they're starting to incorporate this. The vast majority of it is coming out of Eastern Europe and Germany at the moment, but there are American groups like Woodpile who met each other in prison as part of a prison gang. Yeah, I've taken up way more than my allotted time already, so I think I'll leave it there, and we can talk more in the Q&A if people want to. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kirsten, and I appreciate you pointing out, because I failed to in the introduction, that most skinheads are not Nazis or white supremacists. And I apologize to any of our listeners who in particular are on Rash or Sharp. And if you aren't familiar with the scene, please do not lump all skinheads and think that they're all Nazis. Also, just briefly want to piggyback on what Kirsten said about Boyd Rice and Michael Moynihan. Some of their influence had less to do with their music itself than their connection with James Mason, a longtime neo-Nazi activist who wrote Siege. The book is actually edited by Moynihan, who helped create it. And this is the sort of the New Turner Diaries that all the kids are reading who are interested in neo-Nazi terrorism today. So musicians can influence politics not just through their own music, but by using their networks and their the abilities that they've cultivated doing cultural work. So next up is Shannon Martinez. I'm sure she's sick of hearing this, but her and I grew up in Georgia at the same time, and we're actually part of the same music scene, although on somewhat different ends of it. And so, Shannon, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize in advance. I have a terrible cold, not COVID, but so I'll do my best to be coherent. I don't think you and I ever actually like fought though. I think I fought your friends and you fought my friends at the time. So for me, I've been out of the neo-Nazi skinhead scene for over 30 years and spent my time in the late 80s and was out by the early 90s. And it took me like all over the country from Ohio to multiple places in Georgia to Texas to Chicago, lots of traveling to, Idaho, California, like lots of road trips. So much of so many of those road trips were actually because there was music, right? That music was a central tenet of our lives and the way like social networking actually took place. That for me, I actually feel like the racist skinhead movement in America wouldn't have ever happened if it weren't for music. That music was such an integral part of passing along just like lingo and the ideas and the aesthetics of everything that was going on, and it like built like movement cohesion in a way that nothing else could. Like, so it brought multitudinous groups together for like music festivals and things like that, and everybody like utilized the same language and had dressed the same way and had the same aesthetics or whatever, and the majority of that was directly influenced from music. When I began radicalizing into hate and violence, I was 15. I was actually like president of my student class while in high school, like while I was radicalizing into neo-Nazi white supremacy. But the main way that I was sort of like, that I began to be indoctrinated and learn about the language and, the sort of like cornerstones and tenets of these people that I had started hanging around was directly through music. That it is such an easy way for you to start like being immersed and inundated with ideas that up to that point, like you would have found, abhorrent, or even, that you would have at least had like some resistance to or whatever. That, for most people, it's a pretty big jump. Like, even if they grew up in racist families, which I did not, like, not overtly racist, but it's like, it's a pretty big jump from that to like celebrating like Zyklon B as, as a song to sing, talking about the murder of Jews or whatever. But when you're listening to that stuff, you're listening to lyrics of like Screwdriver and No Remorse and like Brutal Attack and Bound for Glory and stuff like that, and you're singing along with these songs, that it inputs that information in a different way and like allows you to like check part of your brain out where you might otherwise like have resistance to these ideas that are being presented. One of the other like aspects of of the importance of music was not just the like oi music that we all, like all the neo-Nazi skinheads of the time, like listened to, but also other oi music and other like punk rock scenes and like hardcore scenes that hardcore was really the overwhelming and like most pervasive like music in the like punk rock scenes of America in the late 80s and 90s. And that was a platform too, where it's like we would show up. It didn't matter if it was a white power band, like we would show up at shows all of the time. That my first intersection with Nazi skinheads was actually like at a punk show that I was at. It was actually like a ska band show that was there, and they they fought all of the time. And we're always there. And so it's like we would show up at every show because there was this, plethora of anti-racist skinheads, of anti-racist punks. And so if we wanted to fight, we knew that we could go to these music shows and go start and cause fights. I think too that it was also that there were leaders at the time that really recognized the power of music and the potential influence of having large scale like white power music festivals. So you get people like Tom Metzger and Richard Butler who see the power in the music that is out there, and how that brought people together in ways, and so that there were multitudinous music festivals throughout the country during that time, and skinheads would come from all over, right? And so this is like, I think this is also the time of the beginning of the rise of like Hammerskin Nation and stuff like that, and like that, the ability to bring everyone from all over the country to unify for like white power music festivals or whatever, like it gives this ability for groups like Hammerskin Nation and stuff to just spread just exponentially. Whereas if they had to actually physically go around to like go talk to all these skinhead crews and everything like that never ever would have happened at all. I think too that it's, for me, like I've thought too, in terms of my belief at this point is that all of the neo-Nazi groups, that it's all transnational, like with the internet and the way that influence works, that everything is transnational. But when I was thinking about this to prepare, I was thinking about how like skinhead music actually was transnational. It had so much of it, it's like every single neo-Nazi skinhead had every single Screwdriver record that there ever was. Everyone knew every single word to every song, and that the music itself created a transnational movement. And that the influence of that, and learning about music coming like out of Ukraine, and learning about the stuff that's like happening in like Poland and Russia, and most of that comes because there's bands that are invited over to the US, and some of the US bands are like invited over to Europe, and that's so that there's this spread of ideas that was transnational, even though like I hadn't really thought of that until I started thinking about this panel and how the transnational nature, and that the conduit for that transnational connection was directly through the music that we were all listening to. I think too, because most of the music that was prevalent and popular at the time that I was in was much like Kirsten's first example of, the oi that she played. And I think part of that too was that a lot of hardcore at the time was still pretty was pretty like hardcore, as opposed to some of the more like melodic hardcore that would come later. And I think part of the appeal of oi and why it was so popular as a unit of cohesion was that it was stripped down, and the lyrics are very are very amplified and forward, but it's all anthemic. Like, it's music that is made to sing along to. It is music that was made to be anthemic. It was music so that if you were standing there in the crowd, like, everyone would sing along to every single word of every single song. And this sort of like movement building tool that was out there. And I think that was really like some of the appeal, was because so much of the music that was happening in the like punk scene and stuff at that time overwhelmingly was music you couldn't really sing along to. There might be a couple anthemic breaks, but overwhelmingly you couldn't really sing along to it. I think also that it was such an essential part of our social life, and what Edward had said about this idea of like the intersection of like music and drinking, and how it was like music was playing all of the time for everything that we did, and it was like, we would get drunk listening to music, and then, you would end up being like, oh, hey, we should like go out and go see if there's anybody to like fight or jump on the street or whatever. That the intersection of those two things was ever prevalent, and how they intersected to like amplify to a greater likelihood that we would engage in some sort of act of hate. that was, again, like such an absolutely like integral part of what we did. And I think to the point of like, so Resistance Records ends up getting, you know, the intersection of like really important like authors, and the intersection of music is really interesting too, because like Resistance Record, after I had left, gets bought by William Pierce, and the intersection of Siege with Moynihan, that it's like the ability to spread their influence, especially to the youth that are involved in the movement, or in the like networks, or, you know, whatever, because, you know, things now aren't really like a movement, it's more just networks and aesthetics and things like that. But that, to me, like that is, and again, like aligning with Tom Metzger and Richard Butler, and how they were amplifying music, and this cycle of ideas, and how they, you know, how they are spread, and how, basically like how networks are built. And so like it seems still to be very true that so many of these ideas are marketed and sold and networked directly through music. And, you know, it's like the music that is part of like neo-Nazi spheres now, it's, I mean, even in like, you know, esoteric Hitler arenas of things, it's like they'll utilize popular music underlaid like very super intense like fast wave videos that are out there, to make it, you know, it's like very shocking images, but it makes it more palatable. That there are, you know, that there are rappers out there like Tech Nine and Wig Nasty and stuff, and it's like some of, you know, like it's terrible hip hop, but it's so filled with like irony and sarcasm and things like that, that it's like, even if you're not necessarily in part of the, you know, this worldview or whatever, like you might actually find it funny. Like there's a Wig Nasty diss track about like Chris Cantwell crying, and like parts of it are terrible, but parts of it are absolutely hilarious. Like parts of it are just ridiculous. And so utilizing like whatever the aesthetics are of the day, that is where, you know, I mean, Nazis infiltrate every space that ever there is. They go in, they co-opt it, and they utilize it for their own ends. And music is not any different from any other space, and, you know, especially like music scenes. And I will stop there because I'm about to lose my voice. So to make sure I can answer questions if you have them. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Shannon, and I appreciate you tying in your work with what Edward said, and particularly about the brown shirts and like how similar those two things can be, and, you know, how I think it emphasizes how much National Socialism is an unbroken movement, and at least in my view, from pre-war to post-war periods. Obviously, it changes with the collapse of the Third Reich, but there are many similarities that continue through them. And up next, we have Luca from Italy. Thank you for joining us. We're very lucky to have him as a former heavy metal journalist, and has, I think, a unique perspective on some of these things.
Former heavy metal journalist, but still a headbanger, a metalhead. So, and a metalhead for the last 45 years. Oh, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, and I was incredibly impressed by the quality and the information I received from my fellow panelists tonight. There are a few things, Kirsten and Shannon, that I didn't know, and the Edward perspective was incredibly interesting. You are tough act to follow, and please, apologies to everyone. I'm Italian, and so my English pronunciation is not the best you can have. I will try to be as comprehensible as possible. No slides, because I will find a bit silly to talk about heavy metal with slides, but my perspective about this. And I will try to compress it, because for the sake of time. Okay, so there is this running joke in the metal community that goes like, how do you know when you are listening to a black metal band? Well, it's a black metal band. If you don't understand the music, you don't understand the lyrics, the name of the musician can be found anywhere. And most important of all, you don't get the band's name, because the logo is designed to be unreadable. It's a joke, and no metal subgenre elicit more satire, more ridicule than black metal. And at least in the logo department, I must say there's been some improvement. But for the old school black metal, that was definitely the standard. So we're faced with this apparent contradiction. How comes the sub-genre, so Nazi black metal, of an obscure sub-genre black metal, of a musical, a type of music, metal itself, that while popular is not and never was mainstream. How it comes, it has become so infamous and notorious, while at the same moment striving for obscurity and real underground status. And another thing, how effective is black metal as a political tool? Let's try to address those questions. On one side, as I've said, black metal is striving to be literally unlistenable and unacceptable. It was designed like this, as a music of rejection. Now, you might remember during the 80s, the moral panic regarding heavy metal in general, with all those organizations accusing metal bands to promote suicide, Satanism, human sacrifice, being closet Nazi, band musician, and so on and so forth. Most of those allegations were simply false. I can tell you, because I've been frequenting that scene for 45 years. While there were and there are few metal groups doing actual real life dodgy stuff, I struggle to remember any metal musician I have met during my career as a music writer who I could not introduce to my parents. And my parents were pretty conservative. But then black metal comes, and it's designed from start to apparently to confirm those allegations. Is an extremely noisy, a musical sound. The singer is mandatory to use what is called the growl. It's not singing, it's growling. There is little to no concession to melody. And at least in appearance, it really promotes Satanism, hatred of Christianity, paganism, occultism, misanthropy, and of course, in some cases, but not all, and this is very important to understand for my audience, it promotes Nazism and racism. But not all black metal bands are Nazi. This is something, a point I want to make clear right now. And it's not a marketing strategy. It's not something designed by a record company executive or a manager, like the shock tactics of bands like Kiss, or Motley Crue. It's a grassroots musical movement. It's born in the garage. Now we don't have the time, but to understand this kind of music, one need to understand the fact that at some point during the 80s, the grip of record companies on how music was created fell, and the rise of tape trading and the grassroots musical movement, underground musical movement, as the main tool to make new music circulate, created what in the age of internet we call disintermediation. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. It's an interesting topic, but let's move on. So, being black metal designed to be considered unacceptable, it's also refused what to some extent made heavy metal popular during the 80s. The entire hedonistic, carefree, oversexed image that was particularly embraced by hair metal bands during the 80s. So again, another contradiction. On one side, we have people promoting Satanism, debauchery, with very graphical images, very often in their cover art. On the other side, and say we're not interested in the rock and roll lifestyle. We are not interested in sex and drugs. We are avant-garde. We are elitist, misanthrope. We hate everybody. We don't want to conform to that standard. Of course, sometimes this is just a pose, but very often it wasn't. And so there is a dark side to it, because we see many old school black metal artists who ended up with actually severe mental problems, problems with addictions, and few of them committed suicide. So this refusal of the fellow human being had, in some cases, bad effect on their psyche. And then there is the politics, and here is where things get interesting and complex. Heavy metal was until the end of the 80s or mid 80s, a fairly unpolitical type of music. One could argue initially that he had a typical conservative slant, and of course we had bands that were toying for the sake of shock with Nazi imagery without being real Nazi, by the way. But the reality is that if you knew the backstages, the actual politics was in general conservative versus liberal type, very, very standard. So we had conservative bands, liberal bands, and so on, notwithstanding the kind of imagery they had. And of course, metal was, until 1986, 1988, mostly white, suburban, Anglophone music. And this, of course, limited the cultural, political range it could have. And then in the second part of the 80s, while the worldwide success of Metallica, with the worldwide success of Metallica, heavy metal becomes global and explodes in places like South America, Southern Europe, Eastern and Southern Asia. And we have local bands beginning to experiment with different types of metals and contamination with hardcore punk, noise, industrial, and with different contents, and there is no more control by the industry. There is no more standardization of what is acceptable and what is not. And so politics become a major theme in heavy metal post 1986 in all sorts of nuances. Now, let's be clear about this. The majority of the band, of the major band, with few exceptions, but the majority of the bands who went really political on a left wing, or at least on a radical anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist direction. And we have names like Napalm Death, Sepultura, Creator, Carcass, Boltrauer, or many other. These are, if you are not familiar with the genre, this name may mean nothing to you, but they are big. I remember probably one of the defining moments of my career was listening to Mille Petrozza, the singer for Creator, that is a German band coming from the Ruhr Valley, saying before the crowds, "This is a anti-fascist concert. We are anti-fascist, anti-racist. And if you are a fascist, just get out. Fascist Raus, fascist Raus." It was pretty, that was the moment where I say, okay, this is getting serious. Of course, there are other bands with more conservative slant, like Slayer, for instance. But in general, very few bands seem to embrace a completely right-wing or Nazi direction. But at the same time, another side of the metal radicalized to the right, and that part was overwhelmingly inside black metal. Now I think to make a couple of pedantic clarification, which I will try to keep as short as possible. The first is that the popular treatment of the subject, like the recent film Lord of Chaos, promotes a very incorrect view of this, like, well, Nazi black metal was born in Norway. We all know about the burning of the churches and so on. This is not true. These people is just collecting different elements, with some people like Varg Vikernes, alias Burzum, who went in prison for killing a member of another band called Mayhem. He was actually in touch with local fascists, and after being released from prison, he exposed what are fascist belief. But the majority of the bands were not even political, and the numbers involved were really small. Because at the time, the numbers of people actively involved in Nazi politics in Norway was very small, okay? Not comparable with fascist or para-fascist movements like elsewhere, like, for instance, in Italy. There were Nazi black metal groups that came out, but the big incubators for this subgenre were the middle of Europe, the former Soviet bloc, France, but not Norway. Okay, this is a simplistic vision. On a slightly less pedantic note, it must be so remarked that there is no one-to-one relationship between black metal, Nazi belief, and actual political militancy. There is plenty of black metal that, while true to the DNA of black metal and the whole concept of extreme musical form and contents that defines black metal, they are not Nazi or racist by any means. There are a lot of people with Jewish background playing black metal. On the other hand, some of the bands are very active inside the Nazi extremist underground. See, for instance, those linked to the so-called Asgard Rai festival that is held in Ukraine, and they have ties with local far-right movement, with the Azov Battalion, and so on and so forth. But there is this gray zone in between that goes from people simply interested in extreme topics or paganism or occultism or the weird for the sake of it, and people who have, maybe they may have nationalist or conservative beliefs, but are more interested in the music than the rest. They are not interested in promoting a political view or putting forward what is an affiliation with an underground political movement. And this gray zone is, in my opinion, the one that makes for most of the current black metal scene. So how effective is black metal as a political tool? It's a difficult question that has not a unique answer in my view. The black metal scene is sprawling globally and is difficult to control, so it's a naturally convenient avenue for underground extremism in the same way that has been discussed by my fellow panelists before. It was in particular effective as a tool to channel funding towards political groups, particularly in the organization of festivals, the sales of collector items or Nazi memorabilia, and so on. But as a tool of the diffusion of Nazi belief, as a tool of outreach for Nazi belief, I don't know. It's not in the same league of the rest of hate music like the one that Kirsten played before, because it's not something you can sing along, it's not something you can listen to casually, it's not something where the message is forthcoming and the words are really clear to understand. Nazi punk or white power, rock and roll, or country music, they're much more effective on this. Some far-right political organizations with strong ties with Catholic traditionalism, like Forza Nuova in Italy, have no problem hosting fascist music festival, but they don't want to have black metal groups around because of the strong anti-Christian message that they have. They don't want to scare some of their supporters away. Far-right groups with pagans roots are more likely to welcome black metal, Nazi black metal, but again, it really depends from the group and from the area. There are places where this is possible, most likely to happen, places where it is less likely. It's interesting to keep in mind that most of the so-called white power rock is usually, as Kirsten has demonstrated before, is usually rather fond of populism, but black metal is elitist to the core. It despises any form of populism. They would, I mean, most of those black metal band, they think they are part of an aristocracy. And this brings us to the last point I want to make. More than the outright militant outreach, what has made black metal effective as an asset for the fascist right is the way it has muddled and confused the waters. In this sense, I must say that I'm grateful to my former colleague and fellow metal journalist, Giuliano D'Amico, who knows the black metal scene far better than I do, to be honest, and has helped me to prepare this discussion. for pointing me out that more than Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Kiss, and so on, the real roots of this type of metal culture was a Slovenian band called Laibach, and its form of ironic nationalism, because it creates an incredible confusion between the use of legitimate strong imagery or the interest in extreme topics and the political use of the same. When it becomes impossible to separate the former from the latter, a trick that has been used very often by political extremism, you trigger the connivance. You trigger this the fact to have strange bedfellow going in the same direction, even if they really don't want. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Luca. These have been wonderful presentations from everyone. I'm glad we got such a range of views on these things. Alex, were you gonna pick some questions out for our panelists?
Sure. So there's a very lively discussion happening in Q&A, and some of the questions have been answered in the chat, so that's great because we don't have too long left here, but we'll try to get to a few questions before we close. One of the questions that some people have asked is, how can those interested in metal and in the other genres that have been discussed today be sure or do due diligence to avoid inadvertently supporting Nazi music or Nazi adjacent music? As Luca was just saying, and some others have talked about, that there is a kind of gray area sometimes. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Is this question for me?
Sure, and anyone.
Okay. Yeah. For my area of expertise, by other panelists may have a different idea, it's very difficult to end up supporting a band that is not that is Nazi, and you discover it just afterwards. But what may happen is that you support a band, you end up listening and liking a band like, I make an example, Death Spell Omega, that is a French band. One of the few black metal bands I really like, and then discover later they were rumored to be close to some far-right collective. Yeah, this may happen, but it's part of the obscurity of this. One thing that is very important for me is just try to avoid to go to festivals that have a dodgy area around who have been denounced by militants by hosting Nazi black metal band. This is very important, more than listening to YouTube to music of someone who may have or may have not ties with Nazism. Going to festivals and giving them money attending their show is another thing. Again, most of the metal bands that are around are absolutely, they don't support Nazism, they don't support racism, so it's not easy to end up doing like this.
I'm going to just jump on that real quickly. I get asked all the time if certain bands are Nazi bands. And usually I refer people to, if you can find anti-fascist websites that have a particular interest in cultural affairs, like they tend to be much more on it. And if they're, I think the problem is, as Luca said, a lot of this stuff is very vague. When the bands are really Nazi bands, people tend to know it and they'll be called out. The festivals are a big problem because you will get Nazi bands or borderline bands, fence sitters, we sometimes call them, with even anti-Nazi bands. There's been several instances of this occurring. But yeah, I at least defer to people who spend a lot of time looking at this, and they usually want to call out, people who they get firm evidence that they're tied to, neo-Nazi ideology, or occasionally like actual parties and structures.
Can I just add something quickly, though?
Please.
I think ultimately it's always on you as the listener or as the consumer to do your due diligence if this is something that's important to you. If you know, potential Nazi associations are a deal breaker for you, then it's something that you need to research when you decide if you're going to be a fan and you're going to send somebody, you know, your money or give them ad revenue on YouTube or whatever. Like somebody asked in the chat, you know, about, you know, how can I avoid this completely? And, or, you know, is it okay to listen to stuff and to disassociate the politics? And yeah, I mean, I listen to an awful lot of this stuff as part of my research, and, you know, disassociated myself from the politics, and some of it musically is quite catchy and quite fun if you don't pay attention to the fact that they're, you know, yelling about Auschwitz. But you as a listener have to decide where you draw your own line. And unfortunately, the way the internet and the media is set up right now, that burden is truly on the consumer.
That's another question we can kind of open up to everyone here. Is it possible to separate the art from the politics? In any of these cases, someone in the chat brought up Wagner as an example. What does everyone think about that?
I'll take it from a
yeah, no, you go first. Yeah.
Thanks, Shannon. I do think that you know, art is politics, right? I mean, you can't really separate the two, and artistic forms, whether they're musical, whether they're creative, in other ways, are expressions of different political ideologies. Fascism, socialist realism have their artistic expressionary forms. I do think that you have to consider them together. It's not value neutral. The other thing I just want to say, Shannon, before cutting it over to you, I did appreciate your remark about this integration of music, drinking, and violence. And one of the things I'd be interested in as well from the panel is this perceptions of masculinity and how masculinity is marketed, and the types of masculinity marketed by these bands or by these groups. We saw some examples of females that were in these bands, or front singers, whatever, but I'd be interested in that as well. Thank you.
And I had a very similar answer of just like that the politics are inseparable from it, but it's something that I mean, it's, you know, it's if something is overtly like hurtful, hateful, or like dehumanizing, and you still choose to listen to it, well, like that says something about you, and you still support it with your, you know, with your money or whatever. But that there's, you know, a lot of ambiguity in terms of like value judgments too. Like, you know, I don't know, like we find out all the time that people like whose music we loved, or, you know, whose art we loved, that they were terrible people, or that it turns out that they had terrible pasts and were abusers or whatever. And so it's like, you know, that's an ongoing work that we have to do, like as consumers. It's like, who do we want to give our money to, and what do we want to give our assent to? Even if we might find something artistically, you know, invigorating or inspiring or whatever from like an artistic point of view, that the relationship that we choose to have with that is really kind of up to us, which is, you know, which can be difficult to do, and you know, requires, you know, complexity of deciding what to do. I think too, like the ideas of like masculinity, certainly in you know, in my time in the neo-Nazi skinhead movement, that it was, you know, I mean, that there's this whole picture of this like ideal male, right? That it's like that they're tough and all this stuff. And I think even now that there's a lot of appeal to that, as there's increasingly complex roles that that we want people of multitudinous genders to play, you know, and it's so that both for you know, for males and females, that there's this idea of this sort of like ideal, which is more simplified roles, more traditional gender roles, harkening back to like times of yore or whatever. Even within the like neo-Nazi accelerationist spaces, that a lot of it has to do with like training and stuff. Like you have to do like your push-ups and sit-ups and stuff every day. That this idea of like, you know, having this this, you know, maybe not being like some giant like buff dude, but like being fit and being strong, and the hyper, you know, the hyper focus on this sort of ideal man and hyper masculinity is like so incredibly pervasive in every sort of iteration of this stuff that I have seen and that I know of, and from the people that I have mentored as they've left and stuff, that it is one of that misogyny and this sort of like singular vision of what masculinity really means is just a cornerstone of these spaces.
Thank you very much. I think that's just about all we have time for, unless anyone has any final things that they'd like to throw in.
I'm just going to address that last question really quickly. For every genre where there's a Nazi band, there are probably 100 non-Nazi bands. So like, you know, if you listen to Screwdriver, like there's many other good punk bands that are just as good or better. So you're making a choice to do that. You know, think about your other options.
Thank you all so much. These have been really fascinating presentations. And for all those in the audience, I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but you can check out this recording again and join us for other events in the future. Thank you.